Hi, welcome back to End of Life Conversations, where myself, the Reverend Ana Luisa Armendariz, is here hosting a conversation about what we've noticed this week in our headlines. This week, I shared an article from the New York Times called She Didn't Want to Live with Advanced Dementia, so why was she being kept alive? So, my fellow listeners, what are we thinking about this article?
Yeah, well, we want to invite you all to continue to share and subscribe, and so glad you're here. We had a good conversation just before this, thinking about all the ways affects people, and we've all experienced it. That people who, even if they've stated their wishes that they don't want to be kept alive that way in a state of vegetation or whatever, vegetable or whatever. And there are now ways, and there's new ways to, in your advanced care directives, to speak to that.
Hmm.
Um, that even though that may be the case, when it comes right down to it, when the time comes, and in this article they talk about it, it's much more difficult than just saying, yeah, they don't want to be fed anymore,
Hmm.
because there are rules that the organizations that, the homes might have. There are legal things that could come up. Of course, we had somebody get arrested for having given her mom the treatment that was asked for. Anyway, that's sort of the container that we want to get into here. So yeah, where do we go from here?
Sam?
Hi,
Oh,
I'm Sam Lee Zemke, editor et al. Here. Um, and I've probably had the least direct contact with dementia and advanced like memory care, though my mom was a geriatric fitness person in her career before retirement, and taught brain fitness courses and stuff like that. So there's like an osmotic sort of
You've
relationship
learned
and
some stuff. You've
familiarity.
heard some
I've heard
stories.
it, and I've gone
Yes.
over, in my training that I'm
Mm-hmm.
undergoing in
Mm-hmm.
end of life and death doulaing and grief care is working with dementia and the signs of that, and Alzheimer's
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
and all that sort of stuff. So I'm excited to learn more and chime in if stuff
Yeah. Well,
comes
good.
in.
Well, I just was sharing with my fellows here that when I had the experience with my sister at the hospital at the end of her life, the state of Colorado allows loved ones to take their decedents, their loved one's body, once it has died, out of a hospital and, take them home if they need to have a ceremony or a family wake. It is 100% legal and safe in the state of Colorado, but hospitals can have their own rules that challenge the state's ability to give you permission. So
Mhm.
I was thinking about that as I read this article because people can say, and I just worked on my father's advanced care directive plan last week, and we had this conversation about comatose.
Mhm.
If, he's in a
Mhm.
coma, he really doesn't want to be kept alive forever. And
Mhm.
and I was thinking about how does one advocate with your advanced care directive plan already in place, but how do you go into an industrial medical setting and say to them, what's the verbiage, right?
Yeah.
Can I get my, and I think in the movies, everybody always says, can we unplug them?
Right.
And, that's kind of the euphemism for we need to let them die. But there is pushback, I think, collectively in this culture that they don't like to hear that. So
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
fraught situation.
Yeah, and part of what makes it difficult is that every one of these organizations, the elder homes, the hospice care places, have their own rules and their own way of doing things. And in fact, in the article, they had the people that refused to do what they asked them to do as far as stopping eating and drinking. So they said, "Well, we're going to take her home," and they said, "Well, then we're going to turn you over to
Social
adult
services?
social
My
services,"
Mhm.
God. Oh my
which they did,
God.
which they actually
Mhm.
did,
It's like
and that's
elder abuse.
yeah, elder abuse. And so, turned out the elder abuse folks did get in touch with them, never followed up with them. And it sounds like, they had really good case for this is why we're doing this and this is how we're doing it. And
Mhm.
actually, I love what they actually came up with, which is a great new thing that I hadn't heard of before, is instead of actual VSED, which is stopping eating and drinking, is comfort VSED or comfort, so that it's arranged. It's kind of a compromise in a way. It's arranged so that you only feed the person when they actively are
Yes. Asking.
showing you that they want it, and that can be,
Mhm.
especially with
Mm.
dementia, that can
Mhm.
be certain clues, but you have to know them enough about
Mhm.
those clues
Mhm.
to say
Right.
yes. And if they're saying, "No, I don't wanna eat," then you don't feed them.
Mhm.
So if
Mhm.
they're pushing it away, you don't force it on them.
Mhm.
And I've certainly been in situations where family, and again, it's a cultural thing too. There are cultural and religious beliefs that say, we must continue to feed them. It's a
Right.
culture,
Or it's a
feeding is how
language of
you care.
love, right? Yeah,
Yes. Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Yes, and,
Hmm.
I remember getting trained on discontinuing eating and drinking years ago when I was in hospice, and there was a a question from somebody, a nurse, I think, who was actually working with a family whose member was proceeding with this choice, and she said, "It's terrible because every once in a while they'll remember, like, I want some ice cream."
Mhm.
And I really appreciated the panel of people, the doctors, the clinicians who were there who said, "It's okay to show up with a tablespoon of ice cream and
Mhm.
offer it. Chances are they'll taste it and they'll have enough." Like, that's just it. You're not, like, giving them a
Mm.
pint. And
Right.
so, it is not you don't have to sit and witness your loved one suddenly remember that they want some, you know, fried beans and tortillas or something, like, you can actually and they won't want that much. If they're actively dying, it's food entertainment and not necessarily nourishment.
Mm, mm,
Yeah.
mm, mm.
Yeah.
That uh, brings up a question for me, which is like physiologically, do the two of you know like if VSET has begun and then you give somebody food, like does that cause like a physiological disturbance? You know, like you're
It
saying,
could.
like to just eat a little bit,
Right,
if you've decided that what you want is at a certain point, I don't want to eat
right,
and drink anymore to allow my body to naturally die. Like eating a meal or eating
right.
a little, rice and beans or a little bit of ice cream
Right.
slows that process, but is it going to cause like shock at different points in that
Mhm.
process?
I think it's
Educate me,
just
please.
contingent on what the person is actually asking for.
Hmm,
It is
hmm,
not a full meal. Like, once people are starting the process to die, their appetite is not gonna be like, "Oh my god,
Yeah.
I'm famished. Please give me,
hmm.
a quart of water, root beer floats, and whatnot." From what the clinician said is, like, generally people just want a taste, and a
Yeah,
taste is
yeah.
not going to make it, like, an extreme situation where your body is, containing all the water and liquids and you're puffing up.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
there's it's not a binary, it's
Yeah,
a
yeah.
spectrum.
Right.
And I like they actually in the article, they said that at one point when they had started this new comfort process, comfort feeding thing, that somebody came in with a milkshake and their mom wanted a milkshake and they said, "Okay, have a milkshake." And they didn't
Mhm.
say whether she finished it or not. But I
Right.
love that it's like I love that way of looking at it as being not again, somebody else in there, I think one of the statist or the, what's am I looking for?
Ethicists?
Ethics ethicists, yeah, or a doctor. Somebody said, when they heard about this, they had always felt like it was black and white, and
Mm,
nothing is black and white. That's that's part of our
Mhm.
work, right? Nothing is
Mhm.
black and white, and this is a good way of thinking about just how do we treat it in the moment, with what's really compassionate and caring and loving of the person,
Mhm.
following their wishes, but not asking them to not helping them not to
Forcing.
suffer, yeah, and not to
mhm,
suffer.
mhm,
And
mhm,
possibly if this was and it's being researched actually in my neighborhood here, if the research goes on and becomes something acceptable, I think it could be something could change some of the rules in some of these organizations that it just it's balk against it.
mhm,
So hopefully, I
Mhm.
mean, again, there's going to always be organizations, especially when they're owned by religious institutions, that are going to say,
Mhm.
no, we will not do that. And if you
Mhm.
take them out of here to do it, we're going to turn you in. That's going
Mhm.
to happen.
mhm,
But if you have
Mhm.
mhm,
what they did, and what I think is important for our audience to know is if this is something you're thinking about, they had very, very good documentation of what she had wanted. They had
Mhm,
very good documentation of advice from their doctors about what
mhm,
would make sense, and they had documentation about how they were treating her and how, and they weren't making her suffer, and that they were being kind and caring,
mhm,
and that
mhm,
everybody in the family, including and their doctors, were all on board. And so I think from that, the social services kinda said, "Well, yeah, this isn't an issue," you know?
mhm,
Hopefully, I think that would be the hope anyway.
mhm. I think another piece of this is, that I've been actually thinking about for this past week is and I think about this almost daily, it's values, and
Yeah.
what do we do how do we talk about values? Because this culture also everybody's willy-nilly, just going daily life, doing whatever, no budgets, no thoughts to, what's coming. But I realized this last week I actually worked on some advanced care directives and thought about the process. And there
Mm,
was an article that I read that I may have shared with you about, a physician whose own parents didn't wanna deal with her advanced care directives.
yeah,
And what I realized, it is all so extremely difficult and fraught
yeah,
because language is this the oh, what I want a word, I wanted to say, like, the keen, but I want, like, the driver.
yeah,
Language drives
Mm,
the
mm,
emotional status of a space, of an interaction with somebody who's, like, in a power dynamic of being a hospitalist, a doctor, a clergy, a chaplain that's at a hospital.
mhm,
Those people are always looking to make sure that that client, that person in the hospital is safe
mhm,
and that their needs are being met. So when we show up with, our like, for instance, when I showed up at my sister's, death time at the hospital, I know I raised a lot of red flags asking the questions I did. And the chaplain told me, he's like, "Oh, yeah, you were flagged, and we had to, like, make a bunch of phone calls because you were in the space."
mhm,
And all I was asking is, like, I need to drive my sister to the crematorium because that's what she and I had decided. And so,
hmm.
mm.
Did they tell you what those red flags
oh, no,
were?
because I was
Like,
exhausted at this point
oh,
but he did
of
say to
course, of
me,
course.
he was like, "You created a big kerfuffle here in this hospital. We made a lot of
Mm,
phone calls."
Hmm.
mm, mm,
Fortunately, I found a funeral director who was like, "Shut them down. Let's, like, do our thing here. We got this." But you don't always get the people who are your
Yeah,
advocates. You don't always get the
right,
people who will show up
right,
and like, "We got this. Back off."
right.
Legally, I have every right.
right.
But going back to, being in a situation where your loved one is in a hospital setting and you have a document, that family member's values, and now you're up against the wall of, you know, clergy and or doctors who say, "That's not gonna be okay." Rather than saying, my family wants to, needs to take our mom home, I think that it behooves us to take a moment and to state who mom is,
Mm,
Tracy loved her home. She has her family, her kids, her children. She wanted to die at home peacefully in her bedroom.
Mhm,
How can you help me facilitate that in a very safe and supportive fashion? Because I think that all of us, well, all of me shows up
mhm.
and it's like, my sister said to do this, and that's all. I'm like, I don't have time to waste telling you the story. I think
mhm,
we do need to tell the story because words matter.
mm,
Mm.
mm,
I
mm,
love that, and
mm,
that's maybe something else that we could include when we think about our advanced care directives. Include that in the advanced care directive. This is the story. This is why we're making these choices. Maybe not as part of the directive itself, but maybe we talk about the ethical will
mm,
idea.
mm, mm,
The
mm.
letters, the love letters. That might be
Mhm.
a really good thing to have as part of your documentation, and if nothing else, just something to refer to with your
Right.
caregivers.
Well,
Mhm.
it's not I think it's the health proxy's, um, job
Yeah,
to know this. I don't know that it needs to be on a specific piece of paper or marked down, but if you are speaking for somebody who is unable to speak for themselves, you are using that voice and
yeah,
narrating that story rather than saying, I have the legal power to do the following. And if you're met with resistance at a hospital, in this case, she had dementia, and family's like, okay, we're done here, right?
Mhm.
But the hospital said no. So I think it requires, I mean, it's almost like getting out of your own body and
Mm.
being a spiritual force in those moments to really
Mm.
tell the story of the person who you're trying to support.
Yeah.
This sounds also like a really like key point where having non-familial support would be
It
really
could be.
helpful, because
Yeah.
if your parent is dying,
Right.
to be
You're
like, I need
toast.
to step away from this,
Yeah.
step away
Yeah.
from my experience
Yeah.
in this and say, look, I'm going to bring my softest, kindest,
Yeah.
most encouraging, positive self to tell the story of why we need to
Do
get mom
this.
home, when you're like,
Right.
oh my God, I have to take my mom
Yeah.
who's in advanced dementia home to
Right.
die,
Right.
to have somebody who knows the story.
Right.
Mhm.
And I think that's maybe where having that extra context documentation that you
Mhm.
were talking about, Wakil, could be helpful, is to like
Mhm.
uh
Yeah.
help remind like a third party,
Yeah.
like,
Mhm.
this is why, here, like, read this is why, and you can tell the
Yeah.
doctor, like, this is what needs to happen.
Yeah, even if it's not a physical piece of paper attached to it, just having that
Mhm.
conversation or writing
Mhm.
it out as a journal or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
it's part of, we always talk about we need to have these conversations. I just did
Mm-hmm.
one of my before you go classes this weekend, and there was one guy that just kept writing things in the chat, and basically I talked to him afterwards, and he had just had his father die, and he had gone through all this stuff, and he's like, yeah, even if you say these things, they aren't going to do it,
Mhm.
um, so I've had conversations with him since then, and I think that's the important thing to recognize, that having these conversations, and he was also saying he's having a really hard time with his grandfather. I think I forget some other family member that we've heard over and over again this happens, that they just don't want to talk about this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he really does know the value of, because he's just gone through
Mhm.
it, of having these things figured out,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
then to have somebody say, "I'm not going to do that," as you said, it's like having more and more we can have these conversations, and the more we can maybe find ways, baby steps into the conversation to just and I've talked about that with people, we've talked about, I think, on the podcast too, just how do you begin that conversation? And maybe it can be simply, hey,
Mhm.
tell me a story about what your values are, your life.
Mhm.
And then, do you really, is that your value when you're not going to be here anymore? I don't know, there's
Yeah,
ways that you
well,
can finesse it, but
that's true, but you know what? So for that, I would say you can't ask them about values because people don't think about that in a day to day.
yeah.
I think you and I talked about it on our podcast. Was you to ask them a story about a time when they've experienced a death and how it went and
Mm-hmm.
what they noticed, because I this country does not operate on values. This
Yeah.
country operates on like, I'm gonna fly by the seat of my pants. I'm gonna take you down if you don't do what I say. And then
Yeah.
there's like a legal battle and mom's dying, bleeding out because nobody wants to assume that she's dying right now. We got to keep, last ditch efforts to keep her alive. So I still wish I had a PhD in semiotics because I think semiotics is still really key
Yeah.
to both
Yeah.
communicating and articulating what is important to us.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
I would also
Mm-hmm.
say, people start thinking about your values and living by them. You say you have a certain value about end of life. Well, then model it for others who might be resistant, right?
Mhm.
Talk about it. And if nobody wants to talk about it with you, be the weirdo that gets not invited to the next dinner party. Be brave. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's so true. I really appreciate that. And I think, that's what I've talked to this guy about, is you just got to, yeah, just tell your own stories. And that's one of the things we talked about too. You can tell your own stories, and that can sometimes lead to having these conversations. And, there's other options out there. There's death cafes, and there's all these other things that are starting to happen, that I think are
mhm,
other ways to get that conversation going. But it's so important. And one of the other statistics they said, I know we've heard it before, is only like, I think they said one third of people actually have advanced care directives.
right.
And so that's a lot of people that are going to, whose families are going to have a lot of trouble figuring
Questions.
out what to do at
Mhm.
the end of life. And most of us have dealt with that in one way or the other.
Well, let me just put it really bluntly here for anybody who's listening and thinking about these things right now. Listen, you either are going to have your loved one die in a hospital with advanced life care given to them, trying to keep them alive. You won't get to experience a death that is healthy for you, healthy for them. It's going to be what it's going to be. You either like relinquish the right to a good death, or you do the heavy lifting of figuring it out before that happens.
Right. Phew, yeah. Yep.
I'm really
To
kind of like I've had a lot of advanced care directive planning talks this week, and I've learned a lot from the 3 that I've had in the literally the last 5 days, and I'm just kind of chagrined and, like, confused by people's reticence to tell me what they value.
Mhm.
Although, in my father's case, my dad says, "I don't have a lot of money. Please just let me go. I don't want debt to be incurred for you."
Mm.
We went through his finances, and he's like, I'm not gonna have much to go on. If I'm sick, we just have to get going."
Yeah, yeah,
So I appreciated that he values me not having to incur debt,
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
right?
Right.
Not families don't talk like that. They're like, "Mom probably wants to stay alive. Let's, like, do whatever," and it's like $100,000 later and then a $28,000 funeral.
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
so true.
That's been part of my conversation with my mom also in our putting together her advanced care directive is looking at the finances and
Mhm,
how far do you push it and
mhm.
Mhm.
yeah, and how
Yeah.
do you go about these things?
Well, I had surgery last year, last July 25th, and I just got another bill this last week for $4,000, and I was
Ah.
like, "Okay, I cannot if, like, whatever happens to me, I have to just say no more because it's expensive to die in this country."
It's so
Yeah,
expensive, yeah,
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 to do
and
anything.
and that, one of the things that makes the biggest difference is having these conversations and figuring out what you
Mhm,
gotta do, what you're gonna afford, and how you're gonna afford it.
mhm,
And I've got this new nonprofit that I've started specifically to address that. And one of the things
mhm,
we're talking about with that is create your community, have your little group of people. And maybe, I was just thinking about this the other day. And maybe a lot of people already have like a men's group or a women's group or a book club or a spiritual group or a church group or whatever. And that you can grab that group and say, let's have a death cafe together and start
mhm,
talking about this with that group.
mhm,
And
mhm,
then those people are there and you can create this community that is ready to be of service to you. And that could be a place you find your healthcare agent.
mhm.
Could be a place that the people, like you were saying earlier, Sam, the people outside the family are there to participate in the end of life care. So I think that the affordability is such a huge issue in the United
It
States,
is.
and really something that has to be dealt with. And there's
Or not. Honestly,
or
we have to deal with it. We
yeah,
have to plan for it. It's not
yeah,
gonna be covered by anybody else.
no. Yep. I mean, hopefully this nonprofit and its ideas, and I'm not the only one thinking about this, can start
Mhm,
to spread, and other people can start working on how do we make these more things more affordable. I just talked. Here's an interesting thing about that. I was talking to People's Memorial, which is a cooperative funeral home here in Washington State, about how they do that. They have a collaborative of funeral homes that everybody who joins up with them, all the funeral homes who join up with them, have to give 15% off, and they have to follow
mhm,
a certain set of ethics about how they
mhm,
no upselling, that kind of stuff.
mhm,
And he said his biggest fear and his biggest worry is that they the only people that they can do that with are independents.
mhm.
And
Independent funeral homes.
and the independent funeral homes are being gobbled up.
Yep.
Mm, mhm,
So, it's just gonna, maybe a little off the topic here, but in a way, it does address some of the problems that people are gonna have dealing with their people in dementia because they're gonna end up
Mhm,
in these homes that are corporately owned, all about profit, and are not gonna do anything to
mm,
possibly, have liability, right? That's a big, huge problem with these guys is
mhm,
if, we might have liability if we stop eating and stopped feeding this person, we're gonna be liable and we're gonna get sued, which is likely in this country. Um, or, we're gonna go against the law somehow or whatever. So that again, it's a lot of that is based on the fact that this has become corporate and this has become about money making instead of about care. There's
mhm,
very, very few nonprofit funeral homes. There's very, very few nonprofit hospices anymore. It's just not the
yep.
values.
mhm,
And that's where I think you could find people that would be more likely to follow your wishes are the people who aren't in it for the money and aren't worried about being sued,
mm.
if there's anybody like that.
Yep. Anyhow, Great conversation.
Yeah, yeah. Appreciate you all. Any other thoughts before we say goodbye to people?
Plan.
Plan
Talk about
ahead.
it.
Plan.
Yeah, have a conversation, get together with your groups.
And
Find groups that
start with your own stories.
yeah,
Mhm,
Like you were
yeah.
mhm,
saying, that's the easiest road in probably. And
mhm,
this is not an easy road to
mhm.
to get into with people.
That's right,
Oh my
that's right.
god. If you can't even get rid of your own stuff, how are you gonna say, there's gonna be a day when I don't even actually need it?
Oh my
Yeah.
god, so true, so true. Alright, thank you both, and thank you all, whoever are listening, and please, subscribe, share, and come back next week for yet another wonderful conversation.
That's right.
Yes.
Adios.
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 And dying grief and lost conversations about the end of life.